Hello and welcome. Today I am joined by Inna Rudolph, a research fellow at the Center for the Study of Radicalization and a partner at the Candid Foundation, and author of a chapter for an edited volume we have put together at the Foreign Policy Research Institute titled Iraq in Transition, Competing Actors in Complicated Politics. Inna's chapter is The Future of the Popular Mobilization Forces After the Assassination of Abu Mahdi Al-Muhandis. Inna, it's good to have you on Zoom.
Thank you.
Yeah, for watchers or for listeners, this is our second of these events, and as a disclaimer, we are all under quarantine. You are in Berlin, I am in Philadelphia, and so hence why if you are watching this on our backgrounds, you are looking at a bookshelf, or in my case, a wall in my basement. So thank you everybody for watching, and thank you again, Inna, for coming on.
Thanks so much.
So let's just jump right into it. Your chapter, you wrote about the role Abu Mahdi Al-Muhandis played in the Iraqi state and with the Popular Mobilization Forces themselves. For people who may not know who he is or what the PMF are, and for experts for that matter, maybe can you go into a little bit about his role or his former role in the Iraqi state and how that fits in with the PMF?
Absolutely. So Abu Mahdi Al-Muhandis, he used to serve as Chief of Staff of the Popular Mobilization Commission, but he was also the ultimate icon of the Islamic resistance. He was regarded as the architect of the PMF's institutionalization. So practically a lot of experts, Iraq watchers, considered him as playing an essential role towards the PMF being legalized or authorized as a state-sanctioned security agency. So in that terms, he was on the one hand caught within the resistance-leaning camp of the pro-Iranian forces, and on the other hand, he was trying to manage or sort of to balance the state actor facade of the popular mobilization.
And maybe you could talk a little bit about the PMF themselves, because they're a bit of a controversial group, at least in Western countries in dealing with Iraq. But in Iraq, they have filled a void, particularly during the conflict with ISIS, but also in the provision of services, and then how Muhandis fit into all that. Obviously, before his assassination.
The problem with the PMF often is that it has become sort of a catchphrase, Hashtashabi. It's being referred to almost any armed militia on the loose within a roaming, within Iraq. But since 2016, since the passing of the Hashtashabi law, they have been authorized as a state-sanctioned security agency. And this was also part of Al-Muhandis' vision for institutionalization. He wanted to create, on the one hand, a state-endorsed agency, but also an independent one. And this vision was also coded within the text or the wording of the Hashtashabi law, which defines the PMF on the one hand as part of the Iraqi security forces, which gives them a veneer of legality, and on the other hand as independence. Now, the other problem is that the dimensions of this independence have never been defined or delineated. And this gave him a lot of leverage vis-a-vis state actors, or even vis-a-vis the chairman of the PMU Commission, Falah Al-Fayyad, also to distribute resources within the PMU Commission, and on the other hand, to help consolidate power in the hands of the pro-Iranian resistance-leaning factions.
And maybe you can talk a little bit about, Muhandis himself. He came up within the Iraqi state, but clearly has a lot of links to the Iranians, probably not sympathetic to the United States. And I think you discussed a lot of this in your chapter, because I think, before his demise, he actually, you were able to meet him and do some first-person interviews.
Yes, my impression of him was as a charismatic leader. In fact, also the outpour of condolences following the assassination demonstrates or illustrates the fact that his charisma transcended sectarian or tribal divisions within Iraqi society. He had a very interesting biography. He was born in Basra, served as civil engineer, which sort of earns him the reputation of his nom de guerre as Al-Muhandis, which in Arabic means the engineer or the architect. He had joined the ranks of the Dawa party because he became convinced that violent confrontation was the only path to confront the Ba'ath regime. In 1983, he was accused of having orchestrated the bombings in Kuwait against the US and French embassy. But even in the interview that I had with him, he had denied these accusations. He then fled to Iran, and the interesting issue here is that he had never sought to downplay his connections with the Iranian political establishment, also his friendship with Qasem Soleimani and his access to the ears of the IRGC. But he was also quite sarcastic of this assumption across the West that Iran is mainly acting in Iraq through him. So, for example, he emphasized that he had a lot of political connections which he had built during the 20 years that he had spent as a political dissident in Iran. But he also never ceased emphasizing that his outreach towards Iran was part of a conscious alliance building that was meant to serve Iraqi interests first. So, for example, in an interview that he gave for an Iranian newsletter, he also said that it's important for Iraq to have a representative political system. And in the final video footage in his video testament released after his death, he also stressed that the function and the responsibility of the popular mobilization was to serve all segments of Iraqi society, regardless whether Shia, Sunni, Kurdish, or Yazidi. And in a previous report that I published with the Century Foundation, I also demonstrated the way he was capable of navigating and also winning, forging connections with members of the Sunni political establishment and also forming non-Shia brigades within the PMF structure.
And you talked a little bit about in the chapter, and I think it's really worth digging into, is how did his assassination. I mean, maybe for listeners or watchers, you can talk a little bit about how that happened for those who don't know. How has that impacted the PMF? And then maybe his sort of place in Iraqi society. Obviously he's dead, but has he become a figurehead, a martyr for the cause? And this something to aspire to for other leaders who follow on behind him, who take over the mantle of leading the PMF.
Well, his legacy will remain iconic, especially after having been assassinated by a US commissioned strike on the side of Qasem Soleimani. What is important here is that a lot of analysts in the beginning, in the aftermath of the attacks, were fearful of the consequences. And they emphasize the rapprochement or the coming together of the various pro-Iranian elements under the banner of anti-Americanism. Now, I argue in the chapter that this honeymoon phase is not necessarily a sustainable one, and it also cannot overshadow the strategic effect of these airstrikes, which have deprived the PMU of its leading strategist. And it would take a lot of visionary contribution to fill in the vacuum that he had left. It's still questionable whether his successor, Abu Fadak, also known under his nickname Al-Hal, would be able to perform or to materialize Muhandis' vision for power consolidation.
Can you talk a little bit about like the way Iran fits into this? You know, a lot of people always look at Iraq through the prism of Iran. So, A, do you think that that's a wise way to look at Iraqi politics and these actors in Iraq vis-a-vis their relationship with Iran? And two, you know, what do you think the Iranians think about the assassination, and how do you think they're responding to it?
To begin with, in the initial phase of studying the popular mobilization, there was this trend of categorizing them in three ideological currents: those loyal to Khamenei, or like the pro-Iranian factions, those loyal to Sadr, and those affiliated with the Hawza Ilmiya, with the Grand Ayatollah Sistani. But interviews and also my personal field work have demonstrated that there are a lot of nuances within those currents, even within the so-called resistance-leaning or pro-Iranian camp. For example, like with the mushrooming of militia units and their threats against the US presence in Iraq, what we are currently witnessing is mainly an oligopoly on resistance rather than one unifying figure pointing out, let's say, the future path of retaliation. So to come back to your question, for the Iranian perception of those attacks, it has been seen as a huge act of provocation. Also, Iraqi officials have criticized the attack as incursion upon Iraqi sovereignty. And this discourse, this narrative, has been used by Iran also to push or to usher in Iraqi actors, state officials, to push for terminating of the strategic agreements between Iraq and the US for hosting US troops on Iraqi soil. And the expulsion of those troops, the withdrawal of the US from Iraq, has remained one of the main security prerogatives of Iran regarding its neighbor. So on the one hand, it has been beneficial to frame this narrative of expelling occupation forces from a sovereign country. But on the other hand, I think it remains to be seen to which extent they have been able to identify a unifying profile, a leadership profile that has the capacity, but also the authority of keeping this highly heterogeneous structure together, of tying all the loose ends. And I think with Sadr, they already like saw, or it was proven that he was not the right person with the capacity for the job.
And for listeners or watchers, we had a similar interview about Sadr that's placed upon our website, and also a chapter 1 is about the Sadrists, so you can also look at that. Inna, I'm going to ask you one forward-leaning question as we wrap up here, and I asked the same of the other people I talked to about this. You know, currently what's happening, at least in the US, is that we are consolidating positions inside of Iraq as the counter-ISIS mission winds down, both because of concerns about the pandemic, but also because of just other issues going on, a lot of what you talked about, which is the fallout, or at least repercussions from the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and Muhandis. Where is this going? Right. So this is a forward-leaning question. And what are your policy recommendations, which you did lay out in the chapter, so people can click on the actual report. The link is below, and read them for yourselves. But if you're looking at a slimmed down U.S. presence, no matter what, perhaps with a total withdrawal, or at least a mostly withdrawal in the next couple of months, maybe a year. What's the future look like? And I know that that's a hard question to ask, but that's why I like to put people on the spot. And what would you suggest people look out for and consider when making policy, or when considering policy?
In my opinion, in this critical phase, it's important to pay attention to the nuances, which we already addressed in the interview. So to start with, one of the main criticism on behalf of PMU or of resistance-leaning pro-Iranian politicians vis-a-vis Western analysts, but also policy advisors, has been this viewing and acting towards Iraq through the prism of its maximum pressure approach towards Iran. So a way out of this whataboutism, in my view, is to separate the debates about the administrative, the institutional future of the PMF as a state-sanctioned security agency, and also the proxy warfare dimension when we speak about the military and security relations between pro-Iranian militia units and their Iranian sponsors. So it would be essential as a first step, whenever sanctions or punitive measures are being designed, that they take place at the individual fighter level. We have to keep in mind that some of those pro-Iranian formations use this oligopoly on resistance as a smokescreen. On the one hand, they have registered a brigade or two within the structure of the popular mobilization, which gives them the veneer of legality. And on the other hand, they have kept fighters outside of the structures of the popular mobilization. By implementing sanctions at the individual fighter level, we still have an opportunity to pursue and to implement the law as applied to vis-a-vis other state-sanctioned security agencies in Iraq, and also like to frame or like to pursue an adapted policy vis-a-vis elements that are challenging Iraqi sovereignty and the monopoly of the state on the use of force.
Ina, thank you for joining me. This has been great. I learned a lot, and thank you for taking the time. Even though I do know that we are home, both of us at this time because of our current global pandemic. For those just tuning in, we are talking about an edited volume FPRI has put out, titled "Iraq in Transition: Competing Actors in Complicated Politics." In which Ina wrote a chapter 3, if you're really getting specific, the future of the Popular Mobilization Forces after the assassination of Abu Mahdi Al-Muhandis. Ina, this has been great. Thank you for joining me, and thank you for coming on. And thank you everybody for listening or watching.
Thank you.